The morning Martha Bailey rode into Colton Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878. She arrived not with dreams of romance or soft living, but with a leather satchel full of surveying tools, a letter of employment from the Southwestern Land and Development Company, and a heart so carefully shuttered that she had almost convinced herself it no longer needed tending. Dust rose in pale columns around the hooves of her roan mare, as she guided the animal down the main thoroughfare of a town that was still making up its mind about what it wanted to be. Colton Creek had a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon that never seemed entirely dark no matter the hour, a small church whose whitewash had begun to peel, and a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Prout who kept her prices fair and her opinions to herself mostly. The railroad was coming. That was the word on every tongue. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line was pushing westward, and every man with a deed in his pocket was recalculating what his land might be worth once the iron horse came screaming through the valley. That was why Martha was here. She was 26 years old, trained in survey work by her father, Benjamin Bailey, who had been one of the finest land surveyors in all of Missouri before a fever took him 2 winters back. She had worked beside him for 7 years, learning the transit and the chain, learning how to read topography maps and set boundary markers, learning how to hold a level gaze when a man told her the numbers did not add up the way they should. The Southwestern Land and Development Company had hired her on paper without meeting her face to face, and she suspected that when she arrived, there would be a moment of silent recalibration on the part of whoever received her. There always was. She tied her mare to the post outside the land office, a narrow building wedged between the general store and a harness maker's shop, and she pushed through the door with the kind of quiet authority that her father had taught her was worth more than volume. The man behind the desk looked up, and his eyes made that small journey she had grown so accustomed to, from her face down to her leather satchel and back again, working out what category she belonged to. He was a lean, balding man named Arthur Finch, the local agent for the company, and he had about him the look of someone who had learned long ago that the world kept sending him surprises, and the only dignified response was a slow blink and a clearing of the throat. "Miss Bailey," he said at last, because the letter she had written ahead had prepared him at least for her name if not her person. "You are the surveyor." "I am the surveyor," she confirmed, and she set her satchel on the edge of his desk and opened it, pulling out her credentials and her father's old measuring instruments, polished to a kind of faithful brightness. "I understand there are disputed parcels along the creek corridor and the ridge line to the northwest. I would like to begin first light tomorrow if that suits you." Arthur Finch blinked twice and cleared his throat once and then said, "Yes, ma'am, that suits me fine." She had a room at Clara Prout's boarding house by noon, a small but clean room with a window that faced west, and she stood at that window as the afternoon light went amber and long, and she told herself what she always told herself when she arrived somewhere new. She was here to do a job. A good job, done with honesty and precision, was its own kind of reward. She did not need anything more complicated than that. She was not, she told herself firmly, here for whatever else a woman her age was supposed to be looking for in a frontier town in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1878. She was here for the work. Jacob Collier was standing on the roof of the livery stable on the east end of Colton Creek when he first noticed the roan mare tied outside the land office. He was not on the roof for any dramatic purpose. He was patching a section of shingles that had blown loose in the windstorm 3 nights before, and from that vantage point, he could see most of the main street laid out below him like a painted map. He was 30 years old, broad across the shoulder, with hands that had been roughened by cattle work and carpentry in roughly equal measure, and a face that was pleasant rather than handsome, the kind of face that people trusted instinctively without quite knowing why. He had come to Colton Creek 2 years earlier from Texas, following the drift of work northward as the cattle drives reorganized themselves after the drought years. He had driven cattle, he had done fence work for the larger ranchers in the valley, and for the past 8 months he had been working for a rancher named Henry Alcott, whose property sat on the western ridge and who had lately grown very anxious about the railroad surveys and what they might mean for his grazing rights and his property lines. Jacob was not a man who spent much time in the land office, but he noticed things. He noticed the roan mare because it was a good animal, and he noticed the leather satchel because it was not the kind of satchel a man carried, and he noticed the straight, purposeful walk of the woman who carried it. He went back to his shingles and did not think much more about it until supper at Clara Pruitt's boarding house, where he rented a room on the second floor at the north end of the hall. Clara set a table for 7 that evening, and the new arrival came in quietly and took the empty seat near the window and unfolded her napkin with the kind of practiced economy that suggested she had been eating at strangers' tables for a long time and had made a private art of it. Clara introduced her around the table. "This is Miss Martha Bailey, come to do survey work for the land company. Miss Bailey, this here is Jacob Collier, he works out at the Alcott Ranch. That's Thomas Webb, he runs the telegraph. Beside him is Dora and her husband Frank Gaines, they have the dry goods." She gestured and named the last boarder, an elderly man named Prescott who had come west for his lungs and never gone back. Martha Bailey nodded at each of them with a polite economy that matched everything else about her. When her gaze reached Jacob, she said, "Collier, Alcott Ranch. I expect I will be on that land within the week. If Mr. Alcott has any questions about the survey parameters, he is welcome to speak with Arthur Finch at the land office." Jacob set down his fork. "Henry Alcott has a good many questions about the survey parameters," he said. "He also has opinions about them. I would not be surprised if he comes down to the land office himself." "He is welcome to," she said, and she reached for the breadbasket. That should have been the end of it for the evening. Jacob told himself it was the end of it. He ate his supper and talked to Thomas Webb about the weather and listened to Frank Gaines describe a shipment of calico that had arrived damaged and what he intended to do about it. But he was aware, in the way a man becomes aware of a fire burning somewhere nearby, that Martha Bailey was methodical in her eating, that she had ink stains on her right hand, that she was carrying something behind those calm gray eyes that was neither sadness exactly nor hardness exactly, but something more like careful self-sufficiency, the kind a person builds when they have learned that the only reliable thing is themselves. He did not say anything about any of that. He said good night to the table and went upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the spring fencing he still had to finish for Henry Alcott. He was very good at thinking about fencing when he needed to. Martha rose before the sun the next morning, dressed in her practical canvas work clothes, pinned her dark brown hair away from her face with the same 4 pins she always used, and ate a quick breakfast of biscuits and coffee before loading her equipment onto her mare and heading out to the creek corridor where the first disputed parcels lay. The New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1878 was a landscape that did not ask for your approval. It offered itself in great indifferent stretches of scrub and sage, in arroyos that ran fierce after rain and cracked dry a week later, in skies so wide and blue that they felt almost accusatory. Martha had worked in Missouri and Kansas and twice in Colorado, but this country was different. It had an edge to it, a quality of not caring, and she found she respected that enormously. She set her transit on the first station point and began her measurements, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this since she was 19 years old and helping her father pace out boundary lines in the river bottoms of central Missouri. The creek corridor was complex terrain. The creek itself meandered, which was a problem for land boundaries that had been drawn in straighter lines on paper in offices far away. She took her readings, marked her stakes, and recorded everything in her field notebook with the same precise hand she used for everything. She was on her third station point when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider coming down the slope from the direction of the Alcott property. She recognized Jacob Collier's broad-shouldered silhouette before she could make out his face. He pulled up at a respectful distance and tipped his hat. "Miss Bailey, Mr. Alcott sent me to find out where exactly you're setting your stations today. He wants to make sure you know where his north boundary markers are." "I know where the recorded boundaries are," she said, not unkindly, turning back to her transit. "I'm here to verify whether the physical markers correspond to the recorded boundaries. That is the purpose of a survey." He swung down from his horse and ground-hitched it and walked closer, looking at her setup with genuine curiosity rather than condescension, which she noted. "You do this all yourself?" "When I have to, yes. When I have an assistant, I use one. Mr. Finch was supposed to arrange a chain man for me, but the fellow he had in mind apparently decided to go to Santa Fe instead." She checked her level. "I manage." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can hold a chain. I've helped surveyors before back in Texas, if it would be useful to you." She looked at him then, a full direct look, the kind she gave to problems she was trying to calculate. He met it without flinching, which was also noted. "You work for Henry Alcott," she said, "who has a vested interest in where these boundaries fall." "I work for Henry Alcott to tend his cattle and mend his fences," Jacob said. "That doesn't mean I'd lie about a measurement for him. I've never lied about a measurement in my life, and I'm not going to start because a man's nervous about the railroad." She held his gaze for another moment. Something in his face was very direct, very plain, the way a good piece of timber is plain, without ornament but also without weakness. "If you hold that chain correctly and read back what the instrument tells you and not what you wish it told you," she said, "then you may help me today." "That's all I ever do," he said. And so they worked through the morning together, and he was good at it, better than she had expected. He moved the chain pin with precision. He called out numbers clearly. And he did not make conversation when she was concentrating, which was the most valuable quality a chain man could have. At noon they stopped in the shade of a cottonwood grove near the creek and ate from the provisions they had each brought separately, and the silence between them had changed from the silence of strangers to the silence of two people who have spent a morning doing real work side by side and found each other competent. "You learned this from your father," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. "He was a very good surveyor, one of the best in Missouri." "Was. He died 2 years ago." February of '76. She said it without expression, but her hand stilled briefly on her canteen before she drank. "I'm sorry for that," Jacob said, and he meant it simply without elaboration, which she found was exactly the right amount. "Where did you come from?" she asked, because she found she was curious and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. "Texas. Small town outside San Antonio. My father ran cattle, his father ran cattle. I ran cattle too until the drought years made the drives unprofitable and the big spread started consolidating." He paused. "Ended up drifting north. Found work. Colton Creek seemed like a place that was on its way to being something, and I thought I might as well be here when it happened." "Is that all you're waiting for?" she asked. "The town to become something." He looked at her sideways, and something in his expression shifted very slightly, a small and careful warmth. "I suppose that's not all," he said. She packed up her provisions and stood and said they should get back to work, and they did, and she told herself very firmly for the rest of that afternoon that she was here for the survey and nothing else. Henry Alcott came to the land office 3 days later, as Jacob had predicted. He was a big, weathered man of 50, with the confidence of someone who had built something significant in a hard country, and expected that to count for a great deal in any conversation. He had brought with him an old deed and a hand-drawn map of his property that did not entirely correspond to the official records, and he stood in front of Arthur Finch's desk and explained in a loud and authoritative voice that his north boundary ran 120 yards further east than the company's records indicated. Martha was present because Arthur Finch had asked her to be, and she stood to the side with her field notebook open to the station readings she had taken over the past 3 days. "Mr. Alcott," she said when he had finished, "I have taken transit readings at 11 stations along the creek corridor and the north boundary line. The recorded deed boundary and the physical survey agree within a margin of 4 feet across the entire north line. That margin falls within standard tolerance." Henry Alcott looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has expected to deal with Arthur Finch and has found himself dealing with someone he did not anticipate. "You're saying I'm wrong about my own land?" "I'm saying the physical measurements match the recorded deed with standard accuracy, and that the old map you're holding was drawn without instrument measurement, which introduces significant error." She was pleasant about it. She was always pleasant and immovable. "If you'd like, I can walk you through every station point on the North Line and show you the readings." There was a long pause. Jacob was standing near the door, having accompanied Alcott into town, and he watched this exchange with the focused attention of a man who is watching something important happen. He saw the moment when Alcott's resistance shifted from indignation toward a grudging consideration of the possibility that she knew what she was talking about. "All right," Alcott said at last. "Walk me through it." She walked him through it. She was patient and precise, and she did not soften the numbers or embroider the explanation with apology. And by the time they had been through all 11 station points, Henry Alcott was still not happy, but he was no longer arguing with the measurements themselves. He argued instead with what the measurements meant for the railroad negotiations, and that was a different conversation, a political one. And Martha told him clearly that political negotiations were above her professional scope and that she could only tell him where the lines were, not what he should do about them. On the way back to his horse, Alcott turned to Jacob and said, "That is a very difficult woman." Jacob glanced back at the land office door, which had already closed behind Martha, and said, "I think she's a very honest one." Alcott gave him a sharp look. Jacob said nothing more, and they rode back toward the ranch. That evening at supper, Martha was quieter than usual, and Clara Prout, who had a gift for reading rooms, set a piece of fresh apple cake at her place without being asked, and said something about the weather being pleasant and left it at that. Jacob watched Martha eat her cake and noticed the way her shoulders were slightly lower than they had been when she first arrived. Not relaxed exactly, but less armored. And he thought that dealing with Henry Alcott all afternoon would wear on anyone, regardless of how well armored they were. He passed her the coffee without being asked because he had noticed she always had a second cup, and she looked up with a small flicker of surprise and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that was softer than the voice she used for station readings and deed boundaries. "He's not a bad man," Jacob said, keeping his voice low so it was between the two of them. "He's just scared. The railroad changes everything, and he doesn't know if the everything it changes will leave him better or worse." "I understand that," she said. "That doesn't change the measurements." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him for a moment, studying him the way she studied a new piece of terrain, with the frank professional attention of someone mapping what was there. "You're a fair man, Jacob Collier," she said, using his full name the way she did when she was being precise about something. "I try to be," he said. She went back to her cake, he went back to his coffee. Across the table, Thomas Webb was telling a story about a misdirected telegram that had caused a cattle broker in Albuquerque to buy 300 head of the wrong breed. And everyone laughed. And Martha Bailey laughed too. A real laugh, sudden and brief, that transformed her face for a moment into something that made Jacob Collier look at his coffee cup very carefully. The survey work expanded over the following weeks. The railroad company's advance agents arrived in mid-April. A pair of brisk men named Hollister and Crane, who wore city suits and spoke in the manner of people who are accustomed to having their assessments accepted without debate. They brought their own surveyor from Kansas City, a man named Dutton who had round spectacles and an air of permanent mild annoyance. And they set up in the hotel rather than Clara Prout's boarding house, because the hotel had a private dining room and they preferred to eat without being overheard. Martha's survey work and Dutton's survey work were officially independent of each other but practically interconnected, because they were measuring the same corridor for different purposes, and their results needed to be consistent or someone was going to have to explain a discrepancy. She met Dutton at the creek on his second day, and they compared instruments and discussed methodology with the professional courtesy of two craftspeople who respect the craft even when they are not sure about each other. Dutton was competent. He was also, she noticed, receiving a great deal of quiet guidance from Hollister and Crane about which measurements were worth recording and which might benefit from being taken from a slightly different station point. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, precisely and without immediate comment, and she noted it in her field book and went on with her work. Jacob was out on the ridge one afternoon finishing fence repairs when he saw Martha on the opposite slope, standing at her transit, and he saw Hollister's man ride up to her and begin a conversation. He was too far away to hear the words, but he could see, from the way Martha's posture shifted to its full surveying height, that the conversation was not entirely collegial. He watched for a few minutes and then rode down toward them. By the time he arrived, the railroad man had gone. Martha was writing in her field book with the slightly compressed concentration of someone who is being very controlled about something. "What did he want?" Jacob asked. She looked up. She had been working alone that day since he had fencing to finish for Alcott, and she seemed for a moment to consider whether to answer, and then she said, "He suggested that certain station points along the creek corridor might be better located on the west side of the water feature rather than the east side, because that would simplify the easement calculations for the railroad. And if you moved them to the west side, two of the smaller homestead claims would fall partially within the rail corridor and would be subject to easement compensation at a fraction of market value." She closed her field book. "I told him I place stations where the measurements are accurate, not where they simplify someone's paperwork." Jacob was quiet for a moment, looking at the distant slope where Hollister's man had gone. "They might push harder," he said. "Let them push," she said, and there was a quality in her voice that was very like what the landscape around them had, that quality of not caring whether you approved of it or not. But 2 evenings later she came down to supper looking tired in a way that went past the physical, and afterward she sat on the front porch of Clara's boarding house while the warm spring evening settled around her, and Jacob came out and sat in the other porch chair, and they were quiet together for a while, watching the street. "My employer sent a letter," she said at last. "Arthur Finch read it to me today. The company is receiving pressure from the railroad interests to ensure that the survey results are, as they phrased it, cooperative with the development timeline. What does that mean for you?" "It means if I submit results that complicate the railroad's easement calculations, the company may choose not to renew my contract." She said it flatly, looking at the darkening street. Jacob turned to look at her. The last of the evening light caught the side of her face, the clean, determined line of her jaw, the steadiness of her gray eyes, and he felt something tighten in his chest that was both admiration and worry in equal measure. "What will you do?" he said. "What I was hired to do," she said. "Submit accurate measurements. If they dismiss me for accuracy, that is their decision to make and their shame to carry. That's a hard position to hold." "Yes," she said simply, "it is." A soft wind came through carrying the smell of sage and the distant sound of music from the saloon, and she leaned her head back slightly against the chair and closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and Jacob thought she looked, just then, like someone who was very tired of always being the one who held the line. "Is there anyone back home?" he said, and immediately felt the impropriety of it and began to add, "I mean family, anyone who—" "No," she said, without opening her eyes. "My mother died when I was 12, my father 2 years ago. I have a cousin in St. Louis I write to occasionally." She opened her eyes and looked at the sky. "I am entirely self-reliant, which I prefer." "Do you?" he said. "Prefer it entirely?" She turned to look at him. In the evening shadow, her expression was less guarded than usual, softer at the edges, and something moved in it that she seemed to realize after a moment because the guard came back up, quietly and almost apologetically. "I came here for the work, Jacob," she said. "Not for anything else. I want to be plain about that because you are a good man and I would rather be honest with you than let anything grow that I have not invited." He looked at her for a long moment. He could feel the weight of what she had just said, the deliberateness of it, the care she had taken to say it plainly, and he respected it with everything in him. "I understand that," he said, "and I accept it." He paused. "I'll tell you plainly too, since you've been plain with me. I think you're remarkable. I've never met anyone quite like you. But I'm not going to press or push or make your work harder by making you feel like you owe me something. If you're here for the work, I'll be glad to be useful to the work and nothing more." He turned back to the street. "I can wait." She was very still for a moment, then she said, "You said you can wait." "For what might come to be," he said simply. "If anything does, and if nothing does, I'll have spent some time in good company, and that's not nothing." She did not say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke again, it was about the survey calculations, and they talked about those for an hour in the growing dark, and he helped her think through a particularly stubborn problem with the elevation readings near the ridge, and they were both entirely professional about it. And when they went inside, it was Clara Prout who noticed, from where she sat mending in the parlor, that Martha Bailey walked upstairs with something slightly different in her step, as though something inside her that had been very tightly wound had been permitted to be, if not unwound, then at least held with gentler hands for an evening. The trouble with Hollister and Crane came to a head in early May. Dutton, the railroad surveyor, submitted his preliminary findings to the railroad advance team, and his creek corridor measurements differed from Martha's by enough that someone would need to account for the discrepancy. The difference was not in the raw measurements, which were close enough, but in how the station points had been selected and what had been done with the data at the boundary lines. Martha's readings placed the rail corridor slightly east of Dutton's, which meant 2 homestead claims, a family named Vargas who had been working their 40 acres along the creek for 6 years, and an older man named Saul Patterson who had arrived a year before them, fell comfortably outside the easement rather than inside it. Hollister called a meeting at the hotel and invited Martha and Arthur Finch, and he sat at the head of the private dining room table with Crane beside him and Dutton across from Martha, and he explained, in the smooth and reasonable language of a man who had done this many times before, that in the interest of efficiency, it would be useful to reconcile the 2 surveys by accepting a composite of the 2 data sets. "A composite," Martha said. "An averaged result," Hollister said, "which would place the corridor boundary in a middle position. An average of accurate measurements and inaccurate measurements does not produce an accurate result," Martha said. "It produces a number that is neither true to the terrain nor fair to the landowners." Hollister smiled in the way of a man who has decided patience is the appropriate strategic response. "Miss Bailey, I understand your professional commitment to precision, but you must understand that the railroad represents an enormous economic benefit to this entire region. The families along the creek corridor will be compensated fairly. They will be compensated at easement rates, which are set by the railroad and are substantially below market value," she said. "If my measurements correctly place their land outside the corridor, they receive full use of their land and the increased property value that the railroad brings. If your composite shifts the line, they lose significant acreage and receive inadequate compensation. I will not reconcile my measurements with inaccurate data." The meeting ended without resolution, and Arthur Finch walked back to his office with the expression of a man carrying something very heavy and not sure where to put it down. Jacob heard about the meeting from Clara Prout, who had heard it from Thomas Webb, who had heard it from someone at the hotel, which was how information moved in Colton Creek. He was out at the Alcott Ranch when it reached him, and he finished the day's work and rode back to town and found Martha at the land office going through her field books, and he sat down across from her desk and said, "What do you need?" She looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you need to make the case? Documents, witnesses, testimony from the landowners themselves. What would help you?" She studied him. "You're suggesting I fight this officially?" "I'm suggesting the Vargas family and Saul Patterson deserve to know what's happening to their land and to have a say in it. I know those families. I've worked the land next to theirs. They're good people and they've earned what they have." He paused. "Henry Alcott has a lawyer in Santa Fe he uses for land disputes. His name is Robert Pierce and he's very good. Henry wouldn't lend him for this cause, but Pierce has a partner in his practice who doesn't like railroad interests interfering with private land claims. His name is Fellows. You would arrange that, if you want it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that direct measuring gaze. Then she said, "I came here to do survey work, Jacob, not to become the center of a legal battle." "You already are," he said gently. "You just have to decide whether you're going to stand in it properly or hope it goes around you." She closed her field book. She put her hands flat on the surface of the desk and she thought, visibly, carefully. Then she said, "All right, let us write to this Mr. Fellows." The weeks that followed were among the most demanding and most alive of Martha Bailey's life in Colton Creek. She worked with the attorney Fellows, who came up from Santa Fe in a buggy and wore a very good suit, and had the air of someone who genuinely enjoyed the confrontation of powerful interests with precise facts, which endeared him to Martha immediately. She organized her measurement data into a clear, formal presentation, and she accompanied Fellows to speak with the Vargas family, who lived in a neat adobe house beside the creek, and with Saul Patterson, who received them in the shade of his front porch, and listened with the focused gravity of a man who had built everything he had one careful year at a time. The Vargas family was headed by a man named Ernesto and his wife Clara, and they had 4 children and a small orchard coming along the south side of their property that Ernesto had planted himself, tree by tree, and he explained this to Fellows with a steady voice and hands that did not shake even though his eyes showed clearly what the thought of losing it cost him. Martha took notes. She also, at one point when Ernesto was showing them the orchard, stood between the small trees and looked at the pale pink spring blossoms and thought about her father's surveying principle, which was that a line on a map was also always a line through a life, and that the person drawing the line carried a responsibility that went beyond mathematics. She and Jacob rode back to Colton Creek that evening side by side, the sun going down ahead of them in great extravagant bands of orange and crimson, and he said, "You all right?" "I'm angry," she said. "That's reasonable. I don't like being angry, it's inefficient." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Sometimes it's necessary." "Yes," she said. "Sometimes it is." They rode the rest of the way in a companionable quiet that had become, over the past weeks, one of the things Martha looked forward to most without examining why. Jacob had a way of being present that did not demand anything of her, which she had once thought was the thing she wanted from everyone and now found herself, on occasion, slightly wishing was different. She did not examine that thought. She put it away carefully and rode into town and went upstairs and worked on her affidavit until the lamp oil ran low. The legal challenge was filed in the second week of May. Hollister and Crane met it with the expression of men who had expected this eventually, but had hoped it would not come this soon. They brought in their own lawyer from Albuquerque, a sharp-dressed man named Goodwin, and for 2 weeks the matter proceeded through the Territorial Land Office with the slow, grinding ceremony of official processes. During those 2 weeks, Jacob continued his work for Henry Alcott by day, and by evening was often in the land office or at the boarding house, helping Martha organize documents, fetching records from the territorial archives when Fellows needed them, and twice riding out to Santa Fe himself with papers that needed to be delivered by a reliable hand. He did all of this without calling attention to it, and without any apparent expectation that it added to his account with her. One evening, Clara Prout found him in the kitchen at midnight making coffee because Martha was still working and had said absently when he checked on her that she could use another cup, and Clara looked at him with her quiet, perceptive eyes and said, "You're a patient man, Jacob Collier." "She asked for coffee," he said, as though that explained everything, and perhaps it did. The finding came down from the Territorial Land Office on the 22nd of May, 1878. Martha's measurements, supported by Fellow's legal challenge and corroborated by a re-examination conducted by an independent surveyor brought in from Colorado, were upheld. The rail corridor boundary was set at the eastern line Martha had established. The Vargas property and Saul Patterson's claim fell entirely outside the easement. Hollister and Crane left Colton Creek 2 days later. Dutton left the same afternoon, looking, if anything, rather relieved to be going. The railroad project continued, but with a different corridor calculation, and without the particular agents who had tried to bend the survey data to suit the timeline. The morning after the finding, Ernesto Vargas came into town with his wife and his children, and they stopped at the land office, and Ernesto shook Martha's hand with both of his and said, in a voice that was very careful with its steadiness, that he was grateful, and that his family was grateful, and that the orchard would bear fruit that his grandchildren would eat. Martha shook his hand and said she was glad the measurements were accurate and that he had good land and should keep it. He said he intended to. After they left, she sat at the desk in the land office for a long time, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The spring sun came through the east window and laid a long, warm rectangle across the floor, and she sat in it like a cat and did not move and did not think about work. Jacob came in and saw her sitting there, and he read the room the way he read most things, accurately and without fuss. He sat down across from her and said nothing. After a while she said, "My father would have liked this case." "Tell me about him," Jacob said. So she did. She talked about Benjamin Bailey for the better part of an hour, about his absolute dedication to accuracy, his belief that a survey was a form of justice, his habit of humming very quietly when he was concentrating, the way he had taught her to hold the transit level by placing a glass of water on the top and telling her not to spill a drop. She laughed twice talking about him, and Jacob laughed too because her laughter was catching, and she noticed him noticing, and for a moment she did not put that away as quickly as she usually did. "You loved him very much," Jacob said. "He was the best person I knew," she said. "Losing him was—" she stopped. "It made the work more important, I think." Because the work was where he still existed, in the instruments and the notebooks, in the way a good measurement tells the truth. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Jacob said. She looked at him. In the warm morning light, he was looking at her with the uncomplicated honesty that she had come to recognize as simply who he was, not a strategy or a performance but the actual texture of his character, and she felt something in her chest move with a warmth that was not entirely new but was newly acknowledged. "Jacob," she said. "Yes." "When I told you I came here for the work and not for a man," she said carefully, as though she was measuring each word the way she measured a boundary, "I want you to know that I meant it. I still mean it. My independence is not something I am willing to trade for comfort or companionship or safety. I have worked very hard for it, and I will not give it away." "I know that," he said quietly. "I have always known that." "But," she said, and she paused, and the pause had a weight in it that she let sit between them honestly rather than rushing past it. "I have been noticing over these past weeks that your company makes the work feel different. Not easier exactly." More she searched for the right word with the same care she searched for the right station point. "More witnessed," she said at last. "I have not known what to do with that." He was very still. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "Not today, not ever, if that's where it stays." "I am not afraid of it," she said, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it, but it was the truer of the available truths. "I am cautious about it." "Caution is sensible," he said. "Yes," she said. "It generally is." They looked at each other across Arthur Finch's desk in the warm morning light for a moment that stretched long and full, and then Martha Bailey did something she had not done before in all the weeks of their acquaintance. She smiled at him fully, without reservation, the whole width of it, and it was the kind of smile that a person holds back for a long time and then gives all at once and there is no taking it back. Jacob Collier looked at that smile and felt it rearrange something in him permanently, the way a good piece of ground shifts when the water finds its right channel at last. "I think," he said, "that I would very much like to take you to supper, not at Clara's, at the hotel." "Properly? That is an invitation," she said. "It is." "Saturday evening," she said. "Saturday evening," he agreed. She stood and picked up her field book and said she had work to do in the afternoon, and she went out into the May sunshine with her measured step, and outside the window Jacob could see her stop for just a moment on the sidewalk and look up at the blue sky with an expression he could not quite read from that distance but which, on someone else's face, he might have called joy. Saturday came with a sky full of high white clouds, and a wind that had decided to be pleasant rather than difficult for once. Martha put on the nicest dress she owned, which was a deep blue wool that she kept for important occasions, and that she had not worn since a presentation of survey results in Denver the previous October. She wore her hair down for the first time since her arrival in Colton Creek, and Clara Prout, who happened to be in the upstairs hallway when Martha came out of her room, made a soft sound of approval that Martha chose to accept graciously rather than deflect. Jacob was waiting in the front parlor in a clean white shirt and a dark jacket that fitted his shoulders well and his Sunday boots and his hat in his hands. And when she came down the stairs he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so entirely unguarded that she felt a flush of warmth climb from her collarbones to her jaw, which she was grateful her complexion did not readily betray. They walked to the hotel because the evening was too fine for horses, and the hotel was only 4 blocks, and they talked about the survey case on the way there, because it was what they both knew and neither of them felt the need to perform a different kind of conversation to mark the occasion as special. The specialness was already there, underneath the ordinary words, the way good water is underneath good land, present and giving it life even when you cannot see it. The hotel dining room had tablecloths and candles and a Mexican cook who had been born in Chihuahua and had opinions about food that he expressed exclusively through the act of cooking, which were the very best kind of opinions. They had roasted chicken and beans and a corn dish that was extraordinary and a bottle of wine that was not extraordinary but was perfectly adequate. And over the course of 2 hours, they talked in a way that was different from all the previous weeks of talking, deeper and more personal, following threads wherever they led. She told him about her life before Colton Creek, the years of traveling from survey job to survey job, the constant negotiation of being a woman in a profession that had not arranged itself for women, the loneliness that she had so carefully converted into independence that sometimes she could no longer tell which was which. He told her about his years of cattle driving and what it did to a person to be always moving, always passing through, and how he had come to Colton Creek and felt for the first time something that might be the beginning of wanting to stay somewhere. He told her about his younger brother Thomas, still in Texas, who had married young and had 3 children, and who wrote letters that were full of a happiness Jacob had always respected from a distance, while telling himself he had not needed it. "Did you believe that?" she said. "That you did not need it?" He met her eyes. "I believed it was what was available to me," he said honestly. "A man can get very used to what he tells himself is enough." She was quiet, turning her wine glass slowly in her fingers. "I have told myself that too," she said, "about the work being enough." "Is it?" he asked. "It is real," she said carefully. "The work is real and it matters and it is mine in a way that nothing else has been since my father died." But she stopped again, and this time the pause was different from the measured kind. This one had a vulnerability in it that she did not completely intend. "You can say it," he said softly. "I think," she said, That real is not always the same as enough. They were very still, both of them in the candlelight of the hotel dining room, and outside the windows of Colton Creek the May night was warm and the stars were coming out over the high desert, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and then was silent. "Martha," he said, and the way he said her name, careful and full and honest, was very different from anything she had heard directed at her in a long time. "Don't say anything large yet," she said quickly, not unkindly. "I mean that. I need it to be slow. I need to know that it is real and not just the spring and the case being one and the wine." "Then it will be slow," he said. "I told you I could wait." "I remember," she said. They walked back through the warm night, and he walked her to Clara's door, and he held his hat in his hand and said good night with nothing more than a smile. And she went inside and stood in the front parlor for a moment, and then walked upstairs and lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling and permitted herself, for the first time in a very long time, to want something that was not work. June brought the full heat of summer to Colton Creek, and also brought 2 new survey assignments. One extending the creek corridor measurements northward toward the territorial boundary, and one assessing a contested grazing allotment that touched the edge of 3 different ranches. Martha had her own work cut out for the season, and she attacked it with the same focused energy she always brought to everything, but now there was a different quality to the evenings. She and Jacob had fallen into a habit that neither of them had formally arranged. After supper, they would often sit on the porch, or walk down to the end of the street where a stand of cottonwoods made a kind of natural park beside the water channel, and they would talk or not talk as the mood required. He would bring his hat and turn it in his hands in the way she had come to recognize as his thinking gesture. She would sometimes bring her field book, but more often did not. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon in late June, out east toward a formation of red rock mesas that she had been wanting to see since she arrived, and they spent 4 hours among the rocks, and she looked at the geology the way she looked at everything, with the attention of someone who wants to understand how it got there. And he watched her, and was happy in the specific simple way of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. On the way back she led her mare slow to a walk, and he brought his horse alongside, and they rode through the long golden light of late afternoon, and she said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about what you said, about getting used to what is enough." "Yes," he said, "I have been a surveyor for 7 years," she said. "I have been alone for most of that time by choice. I have been proud of that choice. I still am." She paused. "But I have also been using it as a wall, and I am not certain anymore that all walls are wisdom." He was quiet, letting her find her own way to what she meant. "I do not know how to do this gracefully," she said. "Whatever this is." "I don't think grace is required," he said. "I think honesty is, and you have never had any shortage of that." She looked at him sideways, from under the brim of her hat, with the beginning of a smile that was softer than the one she gave the world professionally. "I like you, Jacob Collier," she said, "more than I have allowed myself to say until now." "I am very glad to hear it," he said. "I like you more than I know what to do with, Martha Bailey. I have for some time." She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one that came without editing, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in a long time. They rode back to Colton Creek in the sunset, and when they dismounted outside the livery he helped her down from her mare, which she did not need but did not refuse, and he held her hand one moment longer than strictly necessary, and she let him, and they stood in the last light of the day with the smell of sage and horses around them and looked at each other with a directness that was, on both sides, almost tender. "Sunday next," he said. "Sunday next," she said, and led her mare inside. The summer of 1878 moved through Colton Creek with all the specific beauty and difficulty of a frontier summer. The heat was serious, and the water in the creek ran lower than it had in spring, and there was an outbreak of fever in a homesteader family on the North Road that Clara Prout organized the town ladies to assist with, and Martha went too, because she had been in enough isolated communities to know that skilled hands were more useful than formal social membership. She sat up 2 nights with the sick family's youngest child, a boy of 6 named William, while his mother recovered from her own bout of the fever. She changed cloths and gave sips of water and read aloud from a small Bible that was the only book in the house. And in the small hours of the second night, when the child's fever broke and he opened his eyes clearly for the first time in days and said he was hungry, she felt a relief so sharp it was almost painful. She told Jacob about it the next evening, still tired, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. He listened and then said, "You didn't have to stay those nights." "No," she agreed. "But I was the most useful person to stay. Clara has her own household and the other women have children. I have no dependents." "You have yourself," he said. "That is a dependent worth caring for." She looked at him. "Is that a gentle criticism?" "It is a gentle observation," he said. "I have noticed you give away your rest rather readily when someone else needs it. Your father's instruments take better care than you give yourself sometimes." She was quiet for a moment, not offended but thinking about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "My father used to say that," she said. "Not in those words but in that spirit." She looked at her tea. "He would have liked you." Jacob felt that like something warm moving through him. "I would have been glad of his good opinion," he said. She set down her tea and looked at the street and said, in the manner of someone making a careful declarative statement, "I think I am falling in love with you, Jacob Collier. I'm not certain yet because I have not done it before and I do not have comparative data. But there is something occurring that I believe fits the description." He sat very still. He was afraid, for one breath, that if he moved or spoke too quickly the moment would shatter the way thin glass shatters, quietly and completely. "I believe something similar is occurring on my end," he said at last, very gently, "and it has been occurring for quite some time." "Yes," she said, "I gathered that." They sat together in the warm evening, with the stars beginning to appear, and the sounds of the town settling around them, and the cottonwood leaves moving in the light wind. And it was an entirely ordinary evening in Colton Creek in the New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1878. And it was also one of the most significant evenings of both their lives. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her porch chair, not dramatically, just quietly, and she looked down at their joined hands, and then she turned hers over and held his back. And that was where they sat until Clara Prout called from inside that the evening was getting late and she was locking the front door. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday in August, the most ordinary possible day of the week, which was appropriate for two people who had come to love each other through ordinary acts of honesty and usefulness and patience. He was walking her back from the land office, and they stopped in the shade of the harness maker's awning, because she wanted to show him a notation in her field book, and she was pointing at a number and talking about it, and he was listening. And then she looked up to see if he was following the point, and found him looking at her face instead of the book, with an expression so clear and full that whatever she had been saying about the number left her mind entirely. "I'm not listening to the measurement," he said. "I noticed," she said. And then he kissed her, with his hat in one hand and her field book in the other hand between them, carefully and entirely seriously, and she kissed him back with the same precision and intention she brought to everything she did. And when they separated, they stood there on the Colton Creek sidewalk in the August heat and looked at each other with the expression of two people who have just confirmed something very important. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She retrieved her field book from where it had become somewhat compressed between them and smoothed the cover, and said she needed to finish her notations before supper. He walked beside her to Clara's door, and she went inside, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the summer heat with a feeling in his chest like light. The fall brought the formal completion of the survey work along the creek corridor and the northwest ridge. Martha submitted her final report to the Southwestern Land and Development Company in October, a thorough document with full measurement records, supporting calculations, and a clear professional narrative that Arthur Finch called the most complete survey record he had ever filed. The company, faced with the quality of her work and the legal precedent of the Vargas case, renewed her contract for a further period. this time to assess the Eastern Valley parcels in preparation for the spring homestead wave that everyone expected after the railroad's formal route announcement. She accepted the contract renewal with the professional satisfaction of someone who has done good work and seen it recognized on its actual merits. She wrote a long letter to her cousin in St. Louis that was more personal than her letters usually were, and she mentioned Jacob by name twice, which her cousin would notice because Martha's letters to her were detailed and precise about everything except personal matters, and twice by name in a single letter was, for Martha Bailey, almost a declaration. The announcement of the railroad's formal route came in November. It followed the corridor that Martha's measurements had established, which was also the corridor that best served the established homesteaders along the creek. Colton Creek received confirmation that it would have a station, which caused a celebration at the saloon that lasted 2 days and could be heard from Clara Pruitt's boarding house as a persistent, cheerful noise. Jacob and Martha sat together at the supper table the evening of the announcement and raised their coffee cups to each other, because neither of them was much for the saloon, and Clara Pruitt stood at the head of the table and made a small dignified speech about the future of the town, and everyone agreed that things were looking up. On the walk to the cottonwood grove afterward in the cold November air, Jacob said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" she said. "The future of the town," he said. "And my particular place in it," she waited. "Henry Alcott has offered me a partnership in his operation," he said, "not the full ranch. The South Quarter section and the water rights on the lower creek. It's good land. I would run it independently." She looked at him. "That is a significant offer." "He has no sons," Jacob said. "He has been thinking about how the ranch continues. I have been working for him for 2 years and he trusts me." He paused. "I told him I needed to think about it." "Why?" He looked at her with the plain honesty that was always his most disarming quality. "Because whether it makes sense for me to put down permanent roots in Colton Creek depends in part on whether you are planning to stay in Colton Creek. And I told you I would never press you or push you, so I am telling you about the offer and not asking you anything. Just telling you." She walked for a moment without speaking, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The cottonwood trees stood gray and bare along the water channel, their leaves long since gone, and the sky above was the deep dark blue of a high desert November night with stars everywhere. "My new contract is for 1 year," she said slowly. "And after that, if the survey work here continues, there is no reason I could not renew again. The Eastern Valley work will take at least 2 years. And the railroad will bring legal disputes about new homestead parcels that will require accurate survey work for a decade at least." "That is a purely professional assessment," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Here is a less professional one. I do not want to leave Colton Creek. I have not wanted to leave for some months now, and at first I thought it was the quality of the work, and now I know it is also you, and I am not frightened by that anymore." She took a breath of the cold air. "Take the partnership, Jacob. Put down your roots. I intend to put down mine." He looked at her in the starlight and he thought she was the most beautiful thing in the entire territory, not for any ornamental reason but for the way she stood in the world, upright and honest and fully herself. "Martha," he said. "Yes. I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that your answer, whatever it is, will not change anything between us." She tilted her head slightly. "Go ahead." "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because I think you need me or because I think you ought to. Because I love you entirely and I want to build a life beside yours. Not instead of yours, beside it." She was very quiet for what felt to him like a long time but was probably 15 seconds. The stars were very bright. A coyote called somewhere out on the dark plain. "On certain conditions," she said. He waited. "My survey work continues," she said. "My contracts are my own. My instruments and my field books and my professional reputation belong to me and are not transferred into a marriage. I keep my own accounts." "Agreed," he said immediately. "All agreed without condition." "And," she said, "we are equal partners in whatever we build. in the decisions about the land, about the household, about everything that comes after. I would not want it any other way, he said. An equal partner who can survey a boundary is considerably more useful than a dependent. She laughed, and it rang out across the cold November night, clear and full, startling something in the underbrush. Yes, she said, I will marry you, Jacob Collier. He stepped forward and she met him, and he held her in the cold under the stars, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale, long and full, the kind of breath a person lets out when they have finally set down something heavy in a safe place. They were married in the Colton Creek church on a Saturday in January of 1879, a quiet ceremony with Clara Pruitt and Thomas Webb and the Gaines family as witnesses. And Ernesto Vargas and his wife came too, and Saul Patterson came in his good coat and sat in the front pew with his hat pressed to his chest. The Reverend Moss read the words, and Jacob said his with the plain, straightforward honesty of someone who has never made a promise he did not intend to keep. And Martha said hers in a clear, steady voice that did not waver. And when it was done, and she was Mrs. Collier on paper, she privately noted that she felt entirely like Martha Bailey, who had also become Mrs. Collier, rather than like someone who had been replaced by a new designation, and she thought that was exactly as it should be. They had a small celebration afterward at the boarding house, because Clara Pruitt had made a cake and was not going to let it go to waste, and there was music from somewhere. A fiddle produced by Thomas Webb, who turned out to have been hiding that particular talent. And people danced on the parlor floor and drank cider and talked about the railroad and the spring planting and all the ordinary good things of a frontier community that was finding its feet. Jacob danced with Martha, and she was not a practiced dancer, but she followed him well and did not pretend to be better at it than she was, which he found entirely endearing. And at one point she stood on his foot by accident and apologized with such scientific precision about the angle and velocity involved that he had to stop dancing entirely because he was laughing too hard. They moved into the house on the south quarter section in February, a sturdy two-room adobe that Jacob spent the end of January making weathertight and adding a proper kitchen corner to. And Martha surveyed the property boundaries herself as a matter of principle and found them correct. And she set up her surveying equipment in the second room with the best light, which Jacob had built an extra shelf for without being asked, because he had noticed where she always set her transit. The spring of 1879 was a full one. The railroad crews arrived in March, and the eastern end of town became a constant noise of hammers and voices in half a dozen languages. Mexican workers and Irish workers and Cherokee freedmen building the grade that would eventually carry the iron rails through the valley. Martha was busy with the Eastern Valley surveys, and Jacob was busy with the cattle operation and the spring calving on the south quarter, and their evenings were tired and short, but had a quality of richness that neither of them had possessed before, the richness of two lives that have been honestly joined and are finding the daily texture of that union. Ernesto Vargas's orchard bloomed in April, and he sent over a basket of blossoms to Clara Pruitt's boarding house by mistake, having the old address for Martha, and Clara sent her boy to deliver it to the Collier place on the south quarter, and Martha put the blossoms in a tin cup on the table and looked at them and thought about all the measurements that had to be right for them to exist there. She told Jacob about that over supper, and he said he thought she thought about everything through the lens of measurement, and she said was that a criticism, and he said it absolutely was not. It was the thing he loved best about her, because most people did not think about how things got to where they are, and she always did. And she was quiet, and then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty. Henry Alcott had a bad summer, a sickness going through his cattle herd that took 15 animals before the local veterinarian was fetched from Las Vegas, the New Mexico one, And Jacob spent 10 days in August sleeping very little and working very hard and came home exhausted in a way that Martha recognized and met with practical care, keeping food warm and the water barrel filled, and the demands on him minimal until the crisis passed. He told her afterward that her ability to be useful in a practical way during a difficulty, rather than distressed by it, was one of the things he was most grateful for in her. She said she had learned from her father that distress that impeded action was a luxury, and that useful action was its own form of love. He said that was the most Martha Bailey thing he had ever heard. She agreed that it probably was. In the fall of 1879, she realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told him, not out of fear or reservation, but because she was processing it with the thoroughness she gave every new variable, mapping it against her professional commitments and her physical stamina and her understanding of what would be required. When she told him on a Thursday evening after supper, he was very still for a moment, and then he came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her with an expression so full of tender earnestness that she felt it travel through her entire body. "How are you feeling about it?" he said. "Surprised," she said honestly. "We had discussed it as a future possibility rather than a present one." "Yes," he said. "Life sometimes revises the timeline." "The Eastern Valley survey is nearly complete," she said. "I can finish it before February. Then I will have time to adjust my work schedule for the spring." "You don't have to keep working," he said. She gave him the look that she reserved for proposals that ran contrary to fundamental established fact. "I am going to keep working, Jacob. A child changes the schedule. It does not change who I am." "I know," he said quickly. "I would not ask otherwise. I only meant you could take whatever time you needed." "I know you meant that," she said, and her voice softened. "You always mean the right thing." She looked down at their joined hands. "Are you glad?" "More than I know how to say," he said simply. The pregnancy proceeded well. She continued the Eastern Valley survey through November, wearing her heaviest canvas coat against the winter cold, and occasionally having to modify her transit position for practical reasons that made Jacob, who sometimes accompanied her on the longer survey days, bite back a smile with great discretion. She finished the survey in mid-January and submitted the report to Arthur Finch and the Southwestern Land and Development Company, with 3 weeks to spare before the baby arrived. Their son was born on the 9th of February, 1880, a Sunday, in the adobe house on the South Quarter, with Clara Prout in attendance and the local doctor arriving with satisfying promptness. He arrived in the early afternoon on a day when the winter light was clear and pale, and came through the windows at the angle Martha had always thought was particularly good for reading field notes, and Jacob held him wrapped in a blue blanket and looked at him with an expression that was so unguarded it was almost too private to witness. And Martha, propped against her pillows and properly exhausted, watched Jacob meet their son and felt something in her that had no measurement, no classification. No notation possible, only the clean, wide truth of it. "He looks like you," Jacob said, looking up at her. "His nose is yours," she said. "His forehead is yours." "He is his own," she said and smiled. And it was the wide, full smile that he still, after almost 2 years of having it directed at him, could not receive without feeling it go all the way through him. They named him Benjamin for her father, and the middle name was James for Jacob's. Benjamin James Collier was a solid, serious infant who regarded the world with the focused attention of someone taking measurements, and who slept in decisive blocks and woke with the straightforward demand of someone who had identified a resource deficit and intended to address it directly, all of which his mother recognized and approved of. The months after Benjamin was born were busy in the way that can only be experienced rather than anticipated. Martha returned to limited survey work when Benjamin was 8 weeks old, taking him along in the carrier that Jacob had built for her, a practical structure of wood and canvas that sat on the survey wagon, and if the other surveyors in the territory heard about Martha Collier conducting field measurements with an infant in a custom-built carrier, she was not aware of it, and if she had been aware, she would not have reconsidered. Jacob ran the South Quarter operation with the focused energy of a man who has found the work that fits him, managing the cattle herd through the spring calving season and negotiating with Henry Alcott about expanding the water rights and beginning in the evenings to sketch plans for a larger house, because the two-room adobe was showing signs of being optimistic about how much space a family could share. The larger house became real in the summer of 1880. Jacob built it himself with help from Ernesto Vargas, who had construction skill alongside his farming, and Thomas Webb, who had more carpentry ability than his work as a telegraph operator suggested. It was a proper four-room house, stone and adobe, with a porch on the south side and a room with two windows for Martha's survey equipment and a proper kitchen, and a room for Benjamin and space enough to breathe. Martha surveyed the property lines before they broke ground, because that was the correct thing to do, and Jacob laid the foundation line true to her stakes, and Ernesto teased him mildly that it was a good thing to have a surveyor in the family, and Jacob said it absolutely was. They moved into the new house in October, and Clara Prout and most of the boarding house regulars came for the occasion, and Thomas Webb produced his fiddle again, and Ernesto and Clara Vargas brought tamales, and Saul Patterson brought a bottle of something he described as medicinal, but which smelled considerably more festive than that. And Benjamin, now 8 months old and recently mobile in a determined crawling manner, regarded the gathering of adults from his perspective on the kitchen floor, with the expression of a scientist accumulating data. "You are happy," Jacob said to Martha late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone and Benjamin had been put to bed and they stood on the south porch in the October night. "I am," she said, without qualification or analysis for once. "I am entirely happy, Jacob." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked out at the South Quarter in the starlight, the cattle shapes quiet in the pasture, the water channel catching the sky, the land that was theirs made legal and accurate by her own measurements, and it was a perfect evening in the New Mexico territory, and they were entirely present in it. Over the following years, Colton Creek grew into the town it had been trying to decide to be. The railroad came through in 1881, and the station was built on the east end of town near where Jacob had once been patching shingles on a livery roof, and the town's population doubled in 18 months and new buildings went up, and the school that had been a single room became 2 rooms and then 3. Arthur Finch's land office expanded to handle the volume of new homestead claims, and he took on a clerk and then another one, and he relied heavily on Martha's survey work because she was by this time the best and most trusted land surveyor in that part of the territory, with a reputation that had traveled as far as Santa Fe and Albuquerque. She turned down an offer to relocate to Santa Fe in 1882, a flattering offer from a larger company that would have paid her considerably more. She thought about it carefully and honestly, the way she thought about everything, and she wrote out a consideration of the relevant factors in her field book the way her father had taught her to evaluate complex problems, and when she finished the list the answer was clear. The work here was meaningful and established. The community was one she had helped build. Her family was here. She told Jacob about the offer and the decision the same evening matter-of-factly, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to be certain you chose based on what you actually want, not on what you thought I needed." "I chose based on both," she said. "They happen to point in the same direction. I do not see that as a compromise." He smiled at that, the slow, warm smile she had come to know as his particular expression of being deeply content. Benjamin grew from a crawling scientist to a walking one to a running one, and by the time he was 3, he had developed the habit of following his mother on short survey trips and carrying one of the small chain pins in his small, serious fist with an expression of great professional responsibility. Jacob, watching this from horseback one spring afternoon, felt something in his chest so large and warm it was almost uncomfortable. Martha discovered she was pregnant again in the spring of 1883. She told Jacob in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning straight out without prelude, the way she told him most things. He put down his coffee cup and came around the table and kissed her and said, "Are you pleased?" And she said, "I am very pleased." And he said, "So am I." And Benjamin, who was 3 and had been eating his breakfast throughout, looked up and said, "What?" And they both laughed. Their second child, a girl they named Hannah, was born in November of 1883. She arrived with considerably more drama than her brother had, requiring a longer labor and more active assistance from the doctor. And Jacob, who had been sent to wait in the kitchen and had failed entirely to remain calm about it, was present within 30 seconds of her arrival and stood at the bedside looking at his daughter with an expression that Hannah would not be old enough for many years to understand, but that Martha saw clearly and stored away in the part of herself she kept for the things that were most important. "Hannah," Martha said, trying the name. The baby was wrapped and quiet and looked at the ceiling with the unfocused gravity of the newly arrived. "Hannah," Jacob agreed, and he reached over and tucked the blanket around her with enormous careful gentleness and looked at Martha with eyes that were not quite dry and did not pretend to be. Hannah grew into a person who was immediately and apparently comfortable with horses and uncomfortable with sitting still, which Jacob took considerable delight in and which Martha met with the practical adaptation of a woman who loved her children specifically, for who they actually were, and adjusted accordingly. Benjamin was 5 when Hannah was born and took the role of older brother with a seriousness that his parents found both touching and occasionally exhausting. The household on the south quarter of the Alcott land, which everyone in Colton Creek simply called the Collier place now, had a rhythm to it by the mid-1880s that was particular and earned. Martha's survey instruments occupied their dedicated shelf in the room with the 2 windows. Jacob's cattle operation had grown to include the south quarter and 2 additional parcels along the lower creek. Benjamin could read at 5 and was beginning, with considerable help from his mother, to understand how a transit worked. Hannah could ride before she was 4. Henry Alcott died in the fall of 1885, peacefully in his own bed at the age of 67. He had no children, and he had made his arrangements years before, and the south quarter that Jacob worked had been formally transferred to Jacob's ownership in 1882. And Alcott had left the remainder of the main ranch to a nephew who came from Dallas and turned out to be, after a slow start, a capable rancher who appreciated what Jacob had built on the neighboring parcel and maintained a good working relationship with him. Martha attended Henry Alcott's funeral and stood in the November cold of the church cemetery and thought about the day he had come into the land office and argued with her measurements, and how that had been the beginning of everything, in a way, because his coming to the land office was why Jacob had been present, and Jacob being present was why they had spent that first morning working the creek corridor together, and all of it led here, to this morning, to this particular life. She thought her father would have approved of all of it, even the complicated parts, maybe especially the complicated parts. Jacob stood beside her at the graveside and she took his hand and he held it through the whole of the service, and on the way home she told him what she had been thinking about the chain of events from that first survey morning, and he listened and said he had thought about it many times too, and that he was glad every measurement had been right. They were not all perfectly right, she said, with the precision of someone who is constitutionally incapable of rounding up. The important ones were, he said. She squeezed his hand, and they walked home in the November afternoon light to their children and their supper and their particular life. The years moved as years do in a country that is becoming itself, with the speed of change and the patience of weather. Colton Creek got a proper school building in 1884 and a doctor's office in 1886 and a second general store in 1887, when the first was not sufficient for the population. Thomas Webb remained at the telegraph office until his retirement in 1889, when he went to live with a sister in Colorado, and they gave him a send-off at Clara Pruitt's boarding house because Clara still had it, still ran it with the same fair prices and mostly quiet opinions, though she was slower on the stairs than she used to be and kept a cat now. The Vargas family prospered. The orchard that Ernesto had planted tree by tree matured into something substantial, and by the mid-1880s, he was selling apples and peaches to the railroad commissary and to the town's general stores and to families for 30 miles in every direction. His children grew up and 2 of them stayed on the land and 1 went east to a school in Albuquerque, and his wife Clara became one of the people Martha trusted most in the world. A friendship built on the shared recognition of women who do not perform their competence, but simply exercise it. In 1886, Martha was appointed by the territorial government as an official surveyor, the first woman to hold that designation in New Mexico Territory, which was noted in the Santa Fe newspaper in 2 sentences and in the Albuquerque newspaper in 4 sentences, and which Martha noted in her field book in 1 sentence because it was a professional fact worth recording. Jacob cut out both newspaper mentions and kept them in the tin box where he kept important papers, and he did not mention this to Martha until she found them herself 3 years later and looked at him with the expression that meant she was both exasperated and moved. "I am not a newspaper clipping," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is notable, and I am notably proud of you." She put the clippings back in the tin box and closed it and went back to her work, and if her step on the way to her workroom was slightly lighter than usual, he had the good sense not to say so. Benjamin was 9 in 1889 and had become a serious student of both his mother's survey work and his father's cattle management, and had recently begun the project of resurveying the house garden with a wooden implement of his own construction that was not a transit, but had the spirit of one. Martha watched this with a combination of professional assessment and pure maternal delight, and allowed it entirely. Hannah at 6 had opinions about horses that exceeded her physical capacity to act on them, which resulted in an ongoing negotiation with both her parents about what was safe and reasonable, which she approached by consistently redefining the terms of safe and reasonable. Jacob handled these negotiations with the patience of a man who had learned from the best negotiator he knew, and Martha handled them with the directness of a woman who recognized the specific quality of her daughter's will as a reflection of her own, and respected it even when it made her daily life more complicated. One evening in the fall of 1889, the children in bed and the house quiet with the particular quality of a house where children live and are temporarily asleep, Jacob and Martha sat together at the kitchen table. He was reading the week's newspaper, which came from Santa Fe by rail now, and she was making notes in her current field book on the measurements from a new land claim near the eastern range, and the lamp cast its warm circle over both of them. She looked up from her book and looked at him, at the gray that had begun at his temples in the past couple of years, at the good, strong, familiar lines of his face in the lamplight, at his hands on the newspaper, the same hands that had helped her hold a survey chain on a morning in the spring of 1878 when she had not been looking for anything except accurate measurements. "Jacob," she said. He looked up. "Yes." "I am very glad you waited," she said. He put down the newspaper and looked at her fully, and in his expression was everything that 11 years of shared life had built, the mornings and the difficulties and the cattle sickness and the legal battles and the children's births and the ordinary suppers and the extraordinary moments and all the plain working days that were the actual substance of a life. "I told you I would," he said simply. "You did," she said. "I thought it was a pleasant thing to say." "I never say things I don't mean," he said. "You know that." "I do now," she said. "I believe I knew it fairly early." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made on the porch of Clara Pruitt's boarding house in the summer of 1878, and she turned her hand over and held his the same way she had then. Outside the window, the New Mexico Territory night was large and clear and full of stars, the same stars that had been there on the night she rode into Colton Creek with her leather satchel and her surveying instruments and her carefully shuttered heart, the same stars that had been over the cottonwood grove when she told him she was falling in love with him, the same stars over everything, indifferent and beautiful and permanent. "I came here for the work," she said. "I know," he said. "The work was worth coming for," she said, "and so was everything else." He smiled, and she smiled back, and the lamp burned steady between them. And in the next room Benjamin slept his serious sleep, and Hannah slept her restless one. And the Collier place on the South Quarter sat solid under the stars with its properly surveyed boundary lines, and its stone and adobe walls, and its room with 2 windows where Martha Bailey's instruments kept their careful watch. And outside the cattle moved quiet in the pasture. And somewhere far off a coyote called once into the great dark of the New Mexico Territory night, and was answered and was quiet, and the world held everything it held. The following spring, when the survey work began again, and the high desert opened up from its brief winter into the extravagant bloom of April, Martha set her transit on the first station point of the season, and looked through the eyepiece at the clear, precise line of the horizon. And she thought that a good measurement was still a beautiful thing, still worth the care it required, still honest in the way few things were entirely honest. And she wrote the reading in her field book in her precise, clear hand. And then she straightened up and looked out at the valley laid wide and gold before her, and she breathed the sage-sweet morning air, and she was entirely, completely, and without reservation herself, Martha Bailey Collier, surveyor, wife, mother, and citizen of a frontier that was learning its own borders one honest measurement at a time. Jacob came over the ridge on his horse at mid-morning with Benjamin sitting behind him, because Benjamin had asked to come and Jacob had said yes, because the boy needed to learn how land was made legible. And the 2 of them rode down the slope toward where she was working, her husband and her son, and she raised a hand to them, and they raised their hands back, and she turned to her next station and got to work.